Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Dear people, it gives me an honor and pleasure to speak to you about my book, Murshid Al-Qari, A Reader's Guide to Classical Muslim Religious Literature in English, the Qur'an and Tafsir. So this is a volume which covers the translations of the Qur'an and the Tafsir, or commentaries, that are in English, and that includes whether they are called commentaries or tafsirs or not. In other words, anything that's a commentary is included, as well as some other books about the Quran that are described briefly. And in this book, I have given the bibliographical information about each translation, and I have, or each book, because some of them are authored books, but mostly translations. And I have placed the bibliographical information, and then I have given a historical analysis or historical biography of the author, and then of the translator, and then I've described the contents of the book, and then I give some analysis of the translation. And so this is a book which for the first time analyzes all of the existing Quran translations in English, more or less. Some translations I have made very little comment on, but the main ones that are familiar to most American Muslims I've commented on extensively, including Abdullah Yusuf Ali and the Noble Quran of the Hilali and Khan, and Muhammad Asad, Muhammad Marmaduke Pickthall, and so on. And I've also commented on the translations that are older, which Muslims generally don't use, but have been used by non-Muslim English speakers for a long time, such as Sale and Rodwell and Palmer. And I have furthermore traced the influence of Quran translations on each other, so that one can see how certain translations influenced other translations. And generally you could say that although a few translations are really quite independent, but on the whole, most of the existing Quran translations have taken some of their inspiration for translation from earlier translators. And so you could practically make a great tree of English language Quran translation that descends from and goes back directly to the anonymous translation of 1649 that was once attributed to Alexander Ross, although now it has been demonstrated that the actual translator is anonymous and is probably not Alexander Ross. But anyway, through that we see the process of all of these translations, how they influenced each other, and how the influence of some of the translations has been neglected. Also, it will be astonishing to a lot of English-speaking Muslims how many translations there are. The total number of translations must exceed 100. And many of these are completely unknown to people here. This is because people in many parts of the Muslim world who use English for one purpose or another, one way or another, often as a second language, also make their own translations and circulate those translations locally. And then in some cases, those translations filter out throughout the world and eventually come to have influence. So it's a very interesting point, an interesting question, how the Quran translations actually have influenced each other and how they work. And this is because as well that different Muslim communities use different translations of the Quran. And sometimes they swear by a particular translation as this is the authentic translation and this is the one we're going to use and not something else. More commonly, I would say a lot of Muslims will say, instead of being very dogmatic about it, they'll just say, well, I like this translation, or I like that translation. And they'll just pick a particular translation and as their favorite, because of course one cannot consult all of the translations. However, it is desirable for English-speaking Muslims who are using English language translations of the Quran and commentaries on the Quran, to consult a variety of these in order to understand all of the ways in which various verses have been interpreted. And that will help the readers to get a broader appreciation of the gamut of interpretation that has happened historically over Quran translation in Islam. And one can also see from the commentaries this, because it comes out maybe more clearly in the commentaries. Many of the translations are just bare translations with either no commentary or a very, very slight amount of commentary, where a couple of notes are placed here and there to identify something, but hardly anything. Whereas other commentaries are extremely extensive, lengthy commentaries, multi-volume sets, which have been worked on and published, most of which have been translated from other languages. Some have been translated from Arabic, and others have been translated from Urdu especially. So one can see the great variety of Quran translation from this, and every one of these works has to be honored as an honest effort that was made by someone, that is, when they were Muslim trying to produce a good translation, because I also did include non-Muslim translations, and although most of those also I would describe as honest efforts, that is, not efforts made to distort the Qur'an's meaning, such as the controversial and very widely used translation of Najib Dawood, who was a non-Muslim of Iraqi origin who became a professor in the United States and was at Princeton, and is the Penguin Classics translation. A lot of Muslims say, oh, this translation is no good because it distorts the meaning intentionally. It does its own way, in its own way, distort things, but I don't think it's intentional. Having looked at it very carefully and read the whole thing, it doesn't seem to me that that's fair to say in the case of that particular scholar that it was an intentional distortion. But the way he distorts is he often flattens out Arabic figures of speech, and he simplifies the text. This is why it's so popular. And that should remind us, which is another point that one has to take away from the whole subject, that a translation is not the book itself. And that is why the Muslims have a universal agreement, which is among all the Muslims, Sunni and Shi'i, and every variety of Muslim throughout the history of Islam, that the true Qur'an is the Arabic Qur'an, and that is it. And the translation is just a translation. We don't say, like the Christians will say, there's the Holy Bible, it's in English. We don't say that. We say the Qur'an is the Qur'an, the translation is just a translation. That's why some of the traditional and conservative Muslims, including some people influenced by Saudi Arabia or Salafi people, would say, this is not a translation of the Quran, it's a translation of the meaning or the meanings of the Quran. And that in order to put a distance between the translation and the book itself. And this is a fair enough point to be observed, because of course the translation is not the book itself. It never can be the book itself. And that is because you cannot put the book back from a translation. And even if you have an ultra-literalist translation like Pickthall, who actually seems to make an effort to use the same word in English to translate the same Arabic word, so that you almost can see what the Arabic is by looking at Pickthall's English, you can't really do it. It is still is not the same as the Arabic Quran. And the Arabic Quran in Arabic has its own cadences and its own effect on the hearers in Arabic, which cannot be reproduced by an English translation. And that doesn't mean that an English translation cannot be a valuable piece of literature in itself. It does not mean that an English translation cannot also be inspiring. It could be that an English translation could do well like that and could be inspiring. This is quite a possible thing. But it is not the same as the Arabic Quran, nevertheless. And the true authority is the Arabic Quran, and that's something we have not to forget. So that might leave the English-speaking Muslims saying, well, then what can we do except learn Arabic? I mean, and not everyone can learn Arabic easily, of course. And so that's not open to most non-Arabic speakers. They're not going to learn Arabic, and yet 80% of the Muslims are not Arabic speakers in the world. And so what do we do? What we do is we look at different translations, different commentaries, and study a variety of these. And when we do that, we get an idea of what is behind that. It's still not the experience of reading the Quran itself in Arabic, but on the other hand, it definitely produces a type of ilm or knowledge. And so it is an activity that also is a valid activity. So it is my hope that through the generous publication of this book by the Lamppost Education Initiative, that this book will help English-speaking and English-reading Muslims to understand the meanings of the Quran and the ways that the Quran has been understood and interpreted by Muslims in different places and times over quite considerable time. And thank you very much. Wassalamu alaikum.